Chapter number 1, The Mindset Shift, From Follower to Leader. The shift from follower to leader begins with a quiet but decisive change in how you interpret responsibility. A follower waits for clarity, for permission, for direction, believing that safety exists inside instructions. A leader, however, assumes that clarity is created, not delivered. This mental rewiring requires you to stop asking what you're supposed to do and start asking what needs to be done. Workers tend to operate within assigned boundaries, protecting themselves from blame by sticking to expectations. Leaders expand those boundaries by accepting ownership of outcomes, even when authority is limited. This is not about titles or hierarchy, it is about internal control. When you think like a follower, you outsource decision-making and rely on others to define success. When you think like a leader, you define success, measure progress, and adjust behavior accordingly. You begin to notice problems earlier because you are no longer just executing tasks, you are observing systems. This shift rewires your brain to move from reactive thinking to proactive thinking. Instead of reacting to deadlines, you anticipate them. Instead of responding to mistakes, you design processes that reduce them. Leadership mindset starts when you stop seeing yourself as someone who completes assignments and start seeing yourself as someone who shapes outcomes. That mental ownership changes how you speak, how you listen, and how you decide. You become less concerned with appearing correct and more focused on being effective. This is the psychological line between dependency and direction, between waiting and initiating, between following movement and creating it. Self-awareness is the engine that powers this transformation, because leadership demands that you observe your own thinking before you attempt to influence others. Followers often operate on autopilot, reacting emotionally to pressure, criticism, or uncertainty. Leaders develop the habit of pausing, analyzing, and choosing deliberate responses. This discipline begins by recognizing internal triggers such as fear of being wrong, desire for approval, or avoidance of responsibility. When these triggers control behavior, you default to follower patterns, silence in meetings, hesitation in decisions, and reliance on consensus. A leadership mindset replaces those reactions with intentional cognition. You start evaluating situations by asking what outcome is required, what variables exist, and what decision moves things forward. This level of thinking requires emotional detachment from ego. Leaders are less concerned with protecting their image and more concerned with improving results. They welcome feedback not as validation, but as data. They analyze their communication patterns, noticing whether they speak in uncertainty or direction. Even subtle changes matter, shifting from "should we" to "we will," from "I think" to "the objective is." These linguistic adjustments reflect deeper cognitive control. Over time, this awareness extends to behavior. You monitor your consistency, your preparation, and your follow-through. You stop blaming time, circumstances, or other people, and instead evaluate your own decisions. This internal accountability builds credibility, first with yourself, then with others. Leadership does not begin when people follow you, it begins when you start managing your own thoughts with precision, discipline, and intention. Discipline separates leadership thinking from occasional initiative. Followers may act decisively once, but leaders build systems that make decisive behavior consistent. This requires structuring your day around priorities rather than impulses. Workers often focus on visible tasks that provide immediate completion, while leaders focus on high-impact decisions that shape direction. This difference changes how time is used. Instead of reacting to incoming requests, you allocate time for planning, reviewing, and improving processes. Discipline also applies to information intake. Leaders actively seek context, understanding how individual actions affect larger objectives. They read reports, ask clarifying questions, and challenge assumptions. This habit reduces dependency on step-by-step guidance. Another critical aspect is decision discipline. Followers delay choices to avoid risk. Leaders accept that imperfect decisions are better than stalled progress. They gather sufficient information, choose a direction, and adjust based on feedback. This iterative mindset removes fear of failure and replaces it with controlled experimentation. Behavioral discipline also shows in communication. Leaders speak with structure, summarizing problems, proposing solutions, and assigning next steps. They do not simply describe issues, they move conversations forward. Over time, this consistency signals reliability. People begin to trust your judgment because your behavior becomes predictable in pressure. Discipline transforms leadership from a personality trait into a repeatable method. It trains your mind to prioritize clarity over comfort, direction over hesitation, and execution over discussion. When discipline governs your actions, initiative stops being occasional courage and becomes your default operating mode. Accountability is the psychological cornerstone that completes the mindset shift. Followers often define accountability as avoiding mistakes, while leaders define it as owning outcomes regardless of circumstances. This difference changes how you interpret setbacks. Instead of asking who caused the problem, you ask what you could have anticipated. This perspective expands your influence because you focus on controllable variables. Leaders understand that control is not about authority, but about response. Even when decisions are made above you, you take responsibility for execution quality, communication clarity, and risk awareness. This ownership builds resilience. You stop feeling powerless because you always identify an action within your control. Accountability also transforms how you evaluate success. Rather than measuring effort, you measure results. You review whether your decisions improved efficiency, reduced confusion, or strengthened alignment. If not, you refine your approach. This continuous evaluation sharpens judgment over time. Another shift occurs in how you handle credit. Followers seek recognition for tasks completed, leaders distribute credit to build trust and take responsibility for failures to maintain stability. This behavior increases psychological safety for others and positions you as a stabilizing force. Accountability also influences preparation. Knowing that outcomes reflect your leadership, you anticipate risks, clarify expectations, and confirm understanding. This proactive preparation reduces chaos and increases confidence. The more consistently you own results, the more your thinking shifts from execution to direction. You begin shaping environments rather than reacting to them, which is the defining behavior of leadership. The final stage of this transformation is internalizing control, where leadership stops being a deliberate effort and becomes your natural lens. At this point, you no longer wait to be empowered, you behave as if responsibility is already yours. You observe gaps in communication, inefficiencies in workflow, and misalignment in priorities, then act to correct them. Your thinking becomes strategic, connecting small decisions to long-term impact. Instead of focusing only on completing work, you consider how processes can scale, how teams can collaborate more effectively, and how clarity can reduce friction. This perspective influences your presence. You speak with purpose, listen for intent, and guide conversations toward resolution. People begin to look to you for direction not because of authority, but because your mindset consistently produces movement. Internally, you operate with calm urgency, balancing speed with clarity. You accept uncertainty as normal and treat ambiguity as space for initiative. Your habits reinforce this identity, reviewing outcomes, refining communication, and preparing before action. Over time, these behaviors compound into credibility. You become someone who creates order, not someone who waits for it. The transformation from follower to leader is not dramatic. It is built through repeated choices to think independently, act responsibly, and evaluate honestly. Once this mindset solidifies, leadership is no longer something you try to display. It becomes the way you perceive problems, the way you organize effort, and the way you influence results without needing permission. Chapter number 2, Clarity of Vision, Knowing Where You're Going. Leadership begins with direction, and direction begins with a clearly defined destination. Without clarity of vision, effort becomes scattered, decisions become reactive, and progress becomes accidental. Workers often move from task to task, responding to urgency rather than intention, completing assignments without understanding how those actions connect to a larger outcome. Leaders operate differently. They define where they are going before deciding how to move. This mental habit transforms behavior because every decision is filtered through purpose. Instead of asking what needs attention right now, you begin asking what moves the mission forward. This eliminates unnecessary activity and reduces cognitive noise. A clear vision also stabilizes thinking during uncertainty. When unexpected problems appear, followers hesitate because they lack a reference point for decision-making. Leaders evaluate whether the problem affects the destination, then adjust accordingly. This keeps momentum intact. Vision also reshapes communication. You stop speaking in isolated instructions and begin framing actions within context, explaining not just what must be done, but why it matters. This increases alignment and reduces confusion. Over time, clarity of direction creates consistency in behavior. You stop drifting between priorities and start executing a deliberate path. Even small actions gain meaning because they contribute to a defined outcome. This is the psychological shift that separates movement from progress. Movement consumes energy, progress compounds it. When your vision is clear, your mind stops chasing immediate satisfaction and begins organizing effort toward long-term results. The clearer the destination becomes, the less you rely on motivation, because direction itself becomes the driving force behind disciplined action. The absence of vision produces subtle but destructive patterns that trap people in follower thinking. When you do not know where you are going, you default to external direction. You rely on instructions, trends, or other people's priorities to determine your actions. This creates dependency, where productivity exists but progress does not. You may work long hours, complete multiple tasks, and still feel stuck because effort lacks alignment. Confusion increases because every new demand appears equally important. Without a hierarchy of priorities, your attention fragments, and decision-making becomes exhausting. Leaders avoid this trap by constructing a mental hierarchy that ranks goals by long-term impact. This structure allows you to say no to distractions without hesitation. It also reduces stress because decisions become simpler. If an opportunity does not support the vision, it is deprioritized. Another consequence of unclear direction is inconsistent behavior. You shift strategies frequently, abandon plans prematurely, and chase short-term wins that do not accumulate. Leaders maintain stability by committing to a defined path and adjusting only when evidence demands it. This consistency builds momentum. Lack of clarity also weakens confidence. When you are unsure of your destination, every challenge feels like a setback rather than part of the journey. With vision, obstacles become data points used to refine strategy. You remain focused because the outcome remains visible. This mindset prevents wasted effort. You stop investing time in activities that feel productive but deliver no strategic value. Instead, you channel energy into actions that compound over time. Clarity does not eliminate difficulty, but it ensures that difficulty contributes to progress rather than distraction. Building vision requires deliberate thinking, not vague ambition. Leaders convert abstract desires into structured direction by defining outcomes with specificity. Instead of wanting success, you define what success looks like in measurable terms, identifying the skills, resources, and milestones required. This process forces strategic thinking. You begin working backward from the desired future, mapping the steps needed to reach it. This backward planning transforms long-term goals into actionable stages. Each stage becomes a checkpoint that guides daily behavior. Another essential method is time horizon thinking. Leaders operate across multiple timelines simultaneously, considering long-term objectives, mid-term priorities, and immediate actions. This layered perspective prevents short-term decisions from damaging long-term progress. You learn to evaluate whether today's effort supports next month's milestone and whether that milestone supports the broader vision. Writing decisions down further strengthens clarity. Externalizing your plan removes ambiguity and reveals gaps in logic. It also creates accountability because you can review whether your actions align with your stated direction. Leaders also refine vision by gathering information. They study outcomes, analyze trends, and observe systems that influence their goals. This research-based thinking reduces guesswork and improves planning accuracy. Over time, this process becomes habitual. You stop reacting to circumstances and start shaping them. Your mind naturally scans for opportunities that align with your direction and ignores those that do not. Vision evolves as you gain experience, but the discipline of defining it remains constant. This is how leaders replace vague aspiration with intentional direction that guides every decision. Once vision is defined, prioritization becomes the operational tool that turns direction into progress. Leaders understand that not all tasks carry equal weight. Some actions create leverage, while others merely maintain activity. The leadership mindset identifies high-impact work and protects time for it. This requires evaluating tasks based on contribution, not urgency. Workers often prioritize what demands immediate attention, while leaders prioritize what produces lasting results. This shift changes scheduling behavior. You allocate focus time for planning, learning, and strategic decisions rather than filling your day with reactive responses. Another method involves filtering decisions through alignment. Before committing to any action, you ask whether it moves you closer to your defined outcome. If not, you reduce its importance. This filtering mechanism simplifies complex workloads. Leaders also break large goals into daily commitments. Instead of waiting for ideal conditions, you create consistent forward motion through small, deliberate steps. This consistency compounds over time. Prioritization also improves communication. You begin clarifying expectations, defining deadlines, and eliminating ambiguity for others. This reduces friction and increases efficiency. When priorities are clear, teams align faster and execution improves. Leaders regularly review priorities, adjusting based on results and changing conditions. This flexibility maintains direction without rigidity. By continuously aligning effort with vision, you avoid drift. Every action becomes intentional, every decision purposeful, and every day contributes to long-term progress. Prioritization transforms vision from an idea into a structured path that guides behavior with precision. Intentional decision-making is the final layer that solidifies clarity of vision into leadership behavior. Leaders do not move randomly, they evaluate options based on alignment, impact, and sustainability. This structured thinking prevents impulsive choices that derail progress. Each decision is treated as an investment of time and energy, and leaders allocate those resources carefully. They consider consequences beyond immediate results, analyzing how actions influence future opportunities. This long-term awareness shapes habits. You begin planning ahead, anticipating obstacles, and preparing alternatives. Decision-making also becomes faster because clarity removes hesitation. When you know where you are going, many options eliminate themselves automatically. This efficiency increases confidence. You stop second-guessing and start executing with conviction. Intentional decisions also create consistency and identity. You behave in ways that reinforce your direction, strengthening credibility with yourself and others. Over time, this alignment produces momentum. Your actions compound, your focus sharpens, and your progress becomes visible. Leaders revisit their vision regularly, refining it as circumstances evolve. This reflection prevents stagnation and keeps direction relevant. You evaluate whether your actions still support the desired outcome and adjust accordingly. This continuous alignment transforms clarity into a dynamic process rather than a static statement. Ultimately, clarity of vision changes how you think about time, effort, and responsibility. You stop drifting through tasks and start shaping outcomes deliberately. The destination guides your behavior, and every step becomes intentional, measured, and aligned with the leader you are becoming. Chapter number 3, Mastering Your Thoughts, How Leaders Think Differently. Leadership begins in the private space where thoughts form before words are spoken and actions are taken. Most people operate with unexamined thinking, reacting to circumstances as they appear, allowing emotions to dictate interpretation. Leaders reverse this sequence. They control interpretation first, which stabilizes emotion and clarifies action. This mental discipline starts with recognizing that thoughts are not facts, they are interpretations influenced by bias, fear, and past experience. When pressure rises, followers often assume worst-case outcomes, personalizing setbacks and amplifying uncertainty. Leaders interrupt this pattern by questioning the narrative. They ask what is actually known, what is assumed, and what decision improves the situation regardless of uncertainty. This separation between data and emotion creates cognitive space. Instead of reacting impulsively, you evaluate variables and choose deliberately. Over time, this habit rewires your response to stress. Urgent problems no longer trigger panic, they trigger analysis. You begin to think in structures, identifying objectives, constraints, and possible actions. This structured thinking reduces mental noise and improves clarity. Leaders also monitor the speed of their thoughts. Rapid, unfiltered thinking often produces exaggerated conclusions. Slowing down allows you to test assumptions before acting. This is not hesitation, it is controlled cognition. You become less influenced by mood and more guided by logic. This shift changes your presence. You speak calmly, decide intentionally, and maintain direction even when others react emotionally. Mastering your thoughts means taking ownership of interpretation, choosing clarity over impulse, and replacing automatic reactions with deliberate reasoning. Emotional control is not the absence of feeling but the ability to prevent emotion from distorting judgment. Leaders experience frustration, pressure, and uncertainty like anyone else, but they train themselves to separate feeling from decision. This begins with identifying emotional triggers that typically produce reactive behavior. Criticism may trigger defensiveness, ambiguity may trigger anxiety, and urgency may trigger rushed decisions. When these triggers operate unconsciously, thinking narrows and options disappear. Leaders build awareness of these moments and apply a pause mechanism. This brief delay interrupts the automatic reaction and allows rational evaluation. During this pause, you reframe the situation by asking what outcome is required rather than what emotion is felt. This shift redirects focus from internal discomfort to external results. Another key practice is emotional labeling. By naming the emotion, you reduce its intensity and regain cognitive control. Once labeled, you can evaluate whether the emotion provides useful information or simply reflects bias. Leaders also regulate their tone and body language, understanding that emotional expression influences group behavior. Calm communication stabilizes teams, while reactive expression amplifies chaos. Over time, emotional discipline becomes habitual. You stop taking setbacks personally and start treating them as operational challenges. This perspective protects clarity under pressure. You become capable of making decisions when conditions are uncertain and emotions are high. Emotional control transforms leadership from reactive management into deliberate guidance, allowing logic to lead while emotion informs rather than controls. Reframing is one of the most powerful thinking tools leaders use to convert obstacles into actionable information. Reactive thinking interprets problems as threats, focusing on blame, risk, and limitation. Strategic thinking interprets the same problems as signals, focusing on opportunity, adjustment, and leverage. This shift begins by redefining the meaning of difficulty. Instead of viewing resistance as failure, leaders treat it as feedback about strategy or execution. This removes the emotional weight of setbacks and replaces it with curiosity. When a plan encounters obstacles, you ask what the situation reveals about timing, resources, or assumptions. This question transforms frustration into analysis. Leaders also reframe uncertainty as flexibility. Without rigid expectations, you gain freedom to adapt. Another reframing technique involves shifting perspective from short-term discomfort to long-term value. Temporary pressure becomes acceptable when connected to meaningful outcomes. This prevents avoidance behavior and strengthens persistence. Leaders also reframe criticism as data. Rather than defending their position, they extract useful insights and discard bias. This selective processing improves decision quality. Over time, reframing changes how you perceive challenges. You stop fearing complexity and start engaging with it. Your thinking becomes solution-oriented rather than problem-centered. This mental habit also improves creativity. By altering interpretation, you discover options that reactive thinking overlooks. Reframing is not positive thinking, it is precise thinking that transforms interpretation into advantage. Leaders deliberately choose interpretations that preserve clarity, expand options, and maintain forward movement even in uncertain conditions. Focus control is the mechanism that protects strategic thinking from distraction and cognitive overload. Leaders recognize that attention determines decision quality. When attention is fragmented, thinking becomes shallow and reactive. Workers often allow external demands to dictate focus, shifting between tasks without evaluating importance. Leaders intentionally direct attention toward high-impact thinking. This begins with defining the question that matters most. By concentrating on one core objective, you reduce mental clutter. Leaders also schedule time for deliberate thinking, separating analysis from execution. During this period, they evaluate priorities, review assumptions, and plan next actions. This structured reflection prevents impulsive decisions. Another technique involves filtering information. Leaders limit exposure to noise that does not influence outcomes. This preserves cognitive energy for meaningful analysis. Focus control also applies in conversations. Instead of reacting to every point raised, leaders identify the central issue and guide discussion toward resolution. This keeps decisions aligned with objectives. Over time, this discipline strengthens mental endurance. You become capable of sustaining deep thought without drifting. Focus control also improves memory and learning because attention is fully engaged. Leaders revisit their goals frequently, ensuring that daily actions remain aligned with direction. This consistent recalibration prevents drift. By mastering attention, you shape your thinking environment, ensuring that logic, not distraction, guides decisions. Focus becomes a strategic tool that protects clarity, strengthens reasoning, and maintains momentum. Self-talk management is the final layer that determines whether your internal dialogue supports or undermines leadership thinking. Most people engage in automatic self-talk that reinforces doubt, exaggerates risk, and limits initiative. Leaders consciously shape this dialogue to maintain clarity and confidence. This does not mean ignoring reality, it means choosing language that promotes effective action. Instead of thinking in absolutes such as failure or success, leaders think in variables such as adjustment and improvement. This reduces fear and encourages experimentation. They replace statements like "this will not work" with questions such as "what would make this work?" This subtle shift activates problem-solving rather than avoidance. Leaders also use directive self-talk to maintain focus. Short, precise instructions guide attention during pressure, reinforcing priorities and stabilizing thinking. Another practice involves reviewing past decisions objectively. Instead of criticizing themselves harshly, leaders analyze what influenced the outcome and identify improvements. This constructive dialogue strengthens learning. Over time, disciplined self-talk reshapes identity. You begin to see yourself as someone who evaluates, adapts, and decides deliberately. This internal narrative influences behavior automatically. When challenges arise, your mind defaults to structured thinking instead of reactive emotion. Mastering self-talk ensures that your thoughts reinforce leadership patterns, supporting calm reasoning, decisive action, and consistent direction regardless of external pressure. Chapter number 4, The Power of Communication. Speak to influence, not impress. Leadership communication begins with intention. Most people speak to be noticed, to sound intelligent, or to fill silence, but leaders speak to move outcomes forward. This difference changes everything about how words are chosen and delivered. When the goal is influence rather than impression, clarity becomes more important than complexity. Leaders remove unnecessary language and focus on the core message, the problem, the direction, and the next step. This structure prevents confusion and accelerates decisions. Instead of explaining every detail, they highlight what matters most and trust brevity to carry authority. This approach also changes preparation. Before speaking, leaders define the outcome they want from the conversation. Whether aligning a team, resolving conflict, or proposing a solution, they decide the purpose first, then shape their words accordingly. This eliminates rambling and increases precision. Leaders also speak in statements rather than vague suggestions. They avoid language that weakens conviction, such as excessive qualifiers or uncertain phrasing. Direct communication signals confidence and reduces ambiguity. Another key behavior is pacing. Leaders do not rush to speak, they pause, gather thoughts, and deliver deliberately. This measured delivery commands attention without force. Silence becomes a tool rather than something to avoid. When you speak with intention, every sentence carries weight. People listen because your words consistently lead somewhere. Over time, this disciplined communication builds credibility. You become known as someone who clarifies direction rather than complicates it. Influence grows not from speaking more, but from ensuring that when you speak, the message is structured, purposeful, and aligned with outcomes. Persuasion in leadership communication is grounded in logic, relevance, and trust rather than performance. Followers often try to impress by using elaborate language or excessive explanation, but this dilutes impact. Leaders persuade by connecting ideas to shared objectives. They begin by identifying what matters to the listener, then frame their message around those priorities. This alignment makes persuasion collaborative rather than confrontational. A practical framework involves 3 steps: define the situation, present the reasoning, and propose the action. This sequence keeps communication structured and easy to follow. Leaders also support their points with concise evidence, avoiding overloading the conversation with data. The goal is clarity, not volume. Another persuasive technique is anticipating objections. Leaders consider potential resistance and address it proactively, demonstrating foresight and preparation. This reduces friction and increases acceptance. Tone also plays a critical role. Persuasion delivered calmly signals confidence, while aggressive delivery creates defensiveness. Leaders maintain steady tone and controlled pace, allowing logic to guide agreement. They also invite input strategically, asking focused questions that encourage engagement without losing direction. This interactive approach strengthens buy-in. Persuasion becomes more effective when combined with decisiveness. After discussion, leaders summarize conclusions and confirm next steps, preventing ambiguity. Over time, this consistent pattern builds trust. People begin to rely on your communication because it leads to clear outcomes. Persuasion stops being about winning arguments and becomes about guiding thinking toward aligned decisions. Active listening is the often overlooked half of influential communication. Leaders understand that influence begins with understanding, and understanding requires disciplined attention. Instead of preparing responses while others speak, leaders listen to extract intent, concerns, and hidden assumptions. This deeper listening allows them to respond with precision rather than generality. They focus on key points, mentally organizing information into problems, constraints, and desired outcomes. This structured listening improves decision quality. Leaders also use reflective responses, briefly summarizing what they heard to confirm accuracy. This technique prevents miscommunication and shows respect without excessive validation. Another listening behavior involves observing tone and nonverbal cues. Leaders notice hesitation, urgency, or uncertainty, using these signals to adjust their response. This awareness strengthens influence because communication becomes tailored rather than generic. Leaders avoid interrupting unless clarification is necessary. This restraint signals confidence and patience. When they do speak, their responses directly address the core issue, demonstrating that listening informed their thinking. Active listening also reduces unnecessary talking. By fully understanding the situation, leaders eliminate redundant explanation and move quickly to solutions. Over time, this habit builds trust. People feel heard, which increases openness and collaboration. Listening becomes a strategic tool that sharpens communication and strengthens alignment. Influence grows because your words reflect understanding, not assumption. This disciplined listening transforms conversations into efficient exchanges that produce clarity and forward movement. Tone control and confidence in speech determine how messages are received, regardless of content. Leaders understand that delivery shapes perception. A calm, steady tone communicates certainty, while fluctuating tone suggests doubt. This does not require loudness. Authority often emerges from controlled volume and deliberate pacing. Leaders avoid speaking too quickly, as rapid delivery signals nervousness and reduces clarity. They pause between key points, allowing ideas to land. This pacing creates emphasis without exaggeration. Confidence also appears in word choice. Leaders avoid filler language, reducing phrases that weaken statements. They replace tentative expressions with clear direction, making communication decisive. Another important behavior is maintaining composure under pressure. When conversations become tense, leaders slow their speech and simplify their message. This steadiness stabilizes the environment and prevents escalation. Tone control also involves adjusting intensity to context. Leaders vary emphasis strategically, highlighting priorities while keeping overall delivery balanced. This dynamic control keeps attention without sounding theatrical. Body language reinforces tone. Upright posture, measured gestures, and consistent eye contact support confident speech. These physical signals align with verbal clarity, strengthening influence. Leaders also practice brevity, understanding that authority often increases when fewer words are used. By delivering concise, well-paced statements, they maintain attention and reduce confusion. Over time, controlled tone and confident delivery create a recognizable communication style. People interpret your calm clarity as reliability, making them more receptive to your direction. Avoiding unnecessary talking is the final discipline that distinguishes influential communication from performative speech. Leaders recognize that over-explaining weakens authority and dilutes key points. Instead of filling silence, they allow conversations to breathe, speaking only when their input advances understanding. This restraint increases impact. When leaders contribute, their words carry significance because they are not constant. A practical method involves summarizing rather than repeating. After discussion, leaders condense the conversation into clear conclusions and next steps. This prevents drift and reinforces alignment. Another technique is asking targeted questions instead of delivering long explanations. Focused questions guide thinking while keeping communication efficient. Leaders also monitor when they are speaking to clarify versus speaking to impress. If the purpose is not clear, they stop and redirect. This self-awareness prevents rambling. Strategic silence becomes a tool for influence. Pausing after a statement encourages reflection and invites response. It also conveys confidence, showing comfort without constant talking. Leaders use this silence to observe reactions and adjust direction. Over time, disciplined brevity shapes perception. People view you as thoughtful and decisive rather than verbose. Conversations become more productive because every contribution is intentional. By speaking less but with greater precision, you shift from seeking attention to shaping outcomes. This controlled communication style reinforces authority, strengthens clarity, and ensures that when you speak, your words move decisions forward. Chapter number 5, Confidence Without Arrogance, Building True Authority. True authority emerges from grounded confidence, not inflated ego. Ego seeks validation, while confidence relies on preparation and clarity. When someone speaks from ego, their communication often becomes defensive, exaggerated, or overly dominant. They interrupt, over-explain, and push opinions aggressively because they are trying to prove worth. Leaders operate differently. Their confidence is quiet, measured, and rooted in competence. They do not need to dominate conversations because their thinking is structured and their intent is clear. This calm presence signals control without force. Real confidence begins internally with self-trust built through consistent performance. When you prepare thoroughly, understand context, and anticipate challenges, you reduce uncertainty in your own thinking. This preparation removes the need for performative behavior. Leaders also separate identity from outcomes. They understand that a flawed idea does not diminish their value, so they remain open to feedback. This openness strengthens authority because it demonstrates security rather than fragility. Another distinction lies in reaction to disagreement. Ego reacts emotionally, attempting to win. Confidence evaluates opposing views, extracting useful insight before responding. This measured response communicates stability. Leaders also avoid exaggeration. They speak in precise language, acknowledging risks while maintaining direction. Over time, this consistency builds credibility. People trust those who remain steady rather than those who fluctuate between dominance and hesitation. Confidence without arrogance means your authority comes from reliability, not volume, and from clarity, not superiority. Competence is the foundation that supports lasting confidence. Leaders invest in understanding systems, anticipating outcomes, and refining decision-making. This depth of knowledge allows them to speak with clarity without appearing forceful. Instead of asserting authority, they demonstrate it through accuracy and foresight. Preparation plays a critical role in this process. Before key conversations, leaders outline objectives, consider potential questions, and structure their points. This deliberate preparation reduces uncertainty and eliminates the need to compensate with overconfidence. They also rehearse mentally, visualizing how they will respond under pressure. This mental simulation improves composure and sharpens delivery. Another behavior that builds competence-driven confidence is continuous learning. Leaders review outcomes, identify gaps, and refine strategies. Each improvement strengthens self-trust. They also seek feedback selectively, using it to sharpen judgment rather than defend ego. Over time, this cycle creates stable confidence grounded in capability. Competence also shapes communication style. Leaders avoid filler language and vague statements, replacing them with structured reasoning. This clarity reinforces authority without aggression. They acknowledge when information is incomplete, then outline how they will gather clarity. This transparency builds trust. Competence-driven confidence does not need exaggeration because it relies on demonstrated ability. The more prepared and informed you become, the less you feel the need to prove yourself. Authority emerges naturally from the consistency of your thinking, the accuracy of your decisions, and the calm certainty with which you deliver them. Emotional stability is another essential component of confidence without arrogance. Leaders remain composed under pressure, preventing emotional spikes from distorting behavior. When stress increases, ego-driven individuals often become louder, defensive, or dismissive. Leaders slow down instead. They regulate breathing, pause before responding, and simplify their message. This calm response stabilizes the environment and reinforces authority. Emotional stability also prevents insecurity-driven behavior such as seeking constant approval or avoiding difficult decisions. Leaders accept that disagreement and uncertainty are normal. They focus on outcomes rather than personal comfort. This mindset allows them to maintain direction even when feedback is critical. Another key behavior is separating emotion from evaluation. Leaders acknowledge their feelings but do not allow them to dictate decisions. They analyze facts, consider options, and choose deliberately. This disciplined response builds credibility. People trust those who remain steady during uncertainty. Emotional control also influences body language. Relaxed posture, measured gestures, and steady eye contact signal confidence without dominance. Leaders avoid exaggerated expressions because they rely on clarity rather than theatrics. Over time, emotional stability becomes habitual. You stop reacting impulsively and start responding strategically. This consistency reinforces internal confidence. You begin to trust your ability to handle pressure calmly, which reduces anxiety and strengthens authority. Emotional stability transforms confidence from temporary courage into a dependable presence that influences others without intimidation. Developing internal confidence requires disciplined habits that reinforce self-trust. Leaders create routines that strengthen preparation, reflection, and decision clarity. One practical method involves reviewing daily decisions. By analyzing what worked and what did not, you refine judgment and reduce uncertainty. This reflection builds confidence grounded in learning. Another technique is setting clear standards for performance. Instead of relying on external validation, leaders measure themselves against defined criteria. This internal benchmark reduces dependency on approval. Leaders also practice controlled exposure to challenge. They intentionally take on responsibilities that stretch capability while maintaining preparation. Each successful navigation reinforces belief in their ability. Self-talk management plays a crucial role. Leaders replace doubt-driven language with directive internal dialogue that focuses on action. This mental framing prevents hesitation. They also manage expectations realistically, avoiding overcommitment that leads to instability. Consistency strengthens confidence. By showing up prepared and delivering reliably, you build a record of competence. Leaders also limit comparison with others, focusing instead on improving their own decision-making. This reduces insecurity. Over time, these habits create psychological stability. Confidence becomes a byproduct of disciplined behavior rather than a temporary emotional state. You stop seeking reassurance and start relying on evidence from your own actions. Internal confidence formed this way remains steady regardless of external recognition or criticism. External authority emerges when internal confidence is expressed through controlled, respectful behavior. Leaders speak clearly, listen attentively, and avoid dominating conversations. They allow others to contribute while guiding direction. This balanced interaction signals authority without arrogance. They also acknowledge expertise in others, reinforcing collaboration rather than superiority. This humility strengthens credibility because it reflects security. Another behavior involves measured decision-making. Leaders gather input, evaluate logically, and communicate conclusions calmly. This process shows confidence without dismissiveness. They also accept responsibility for outcomes, reinforcing trust. External authority is reinforced through consistency. When your tone, posture, and decision-making remain stable, others perceive reliability. Leaders avoid sudden shifts in behavior because inconsistency undermines confidence. They also express certainty appropriately, distinguishing between firm direction and open discussion. This clarity prevents confusion. Respectful disagreement is another marker of confident authority. Leaders challenge ideas without attacking individuals, maintaining professionalism. This approach encourages constructive dialogue. Over time, these behaviors create a presence that commands attention naturally. People respond not because you demand authority, but because your stability and clarity inspire trust. Confidence without arrogance becomes visible in how you speak, listen, decide, and respond. Authority develops quietly, grounded in competence, expressed through calm control, and sustained by consistent, respectful leadership behavior. Chapter number 6, Decision-Making Under Pressure. Think fast, lead smart. Decision-making under pressure is the moment where leadership is either proven or lost. When urgency rises, most people shift into hesitation or emotional reaction. Workers often freeze, waiting for more information, approval, or reassurance before acting. This delay creates stagnation, and stagnation in pressure situations is itself a decision, usually the wrong one. Leaders operate differently. They understand that clarity is rarely perfect when pressure is high, so they train themselves to act with partial information. The key shift is moving from certainty-based thinking to clarity-based thinking. Instead of asking whether they have everything they need, leaders ask whether they have enough to make a directional decision. This subtle change prevents paralysis. Under pressure, thinking must become structured and fast. Leaders simplify complexity by identifying 3 core elements: what is happening, what is at risk, and what action moves the situation forward. This mental filtering removes noise and sharpens focus. Emotional control is critical here. Panic narrows thinking, while calm expands it. Leaders slow their internal rhythm even when external conditions accelerate. This controlled state allows better judgment. They also resist the urge to solve everything at once. Instead, they prioritize stabilizing actions that prevent damage, followed by corrective actions, and finally optimization. This layered approach ensures momentum even in uncertainty. Decision-making under pressure is not about having perfect answers, it is about maintaining forward movement while continuously refining direction. Leaders win in pressure because they do not wait for ideal conditions, they create stability through action. Overthinking is one of the most common failures in high-pressure environments. It disguises itself as careful analysis but often results in delayed action and missed opportunities. Workers fall into overthinking when they attempt to eliminate all risk before deciding. This creates an impossible standard, because no real-world decision is risk-free. Leaders recognize this trap and shift their mindset toward acceptable risk rather than zero risk. They understand that every decision has consequences, but inaction often carries greater cost than imperfect action. Overthinking is also fueled by fear of being wrong. Leaders reframe this fear by separating identity from outcome. A wrong decision is not a personal failure, it is data that improves future judgment. This reduces emotional resistance and accelerates decision speed. Another technique leaders use is time-boxing decisions. They assign a limited window to evaluate options, forcing clarity under constraint. This prevents mental looping and encourages prioritization of key variables. Instead of endlessly analyzing, leaders move through structured questions. What is the objective? What are the options? What are the consequences? And what aligns best with long-term direction? This framework compresses thinking into actionable steps. Overthinking decreases when focus shifts from perfection to progress. Leaders also build trust in their ability to adjust after action. This adaptability reduces fear because decisions are no longer final traps but reversible steps in a continuous process. The ability to act despite uncertainty is what separates leadership from hesitation. Fear-based decision-making is another hidden barrier that weakens leadership under pressure. When fear dominates, thinking becomes defensive. People prioritize avoiding mistakes over achieving results, which leads to overly cautious choices or complete avoidance of responsibility. Leaders actively interrupt this pattern by recognizing fear as information rather than instruction. Fear signals uncertainty, not prohibition. Instead of reacting to it, they analyze it. What exactly is being threatened? Resources, reputation, timing, or control? This breakdown reduces emotional intensity and restores logical thinking. Leaders also replace fear-based questions with outcome-based questions. Instead of asking what could go wrong, they ask what moves the situation forward most effectively. This shift changes cognitive direction from avoidance to action. Another critical strategy is reframing worst-case scenarios. Leaders evaluate the real impact of failure rather than imagined consequences. Most feared outcomes are manageable when broken into practical responses. This rational assessment reduces emotional distortion. In pressure situations, leaders also rely on structured thinking habits to override fear. They default to predefined principles such as preserving momentum, reducing complexity, and prioritizing reversibility. These mental anchors provide stability when emotions fluctuate. Fear cannot be eliminated, but it can be contained and outperformed. Leaders do not wait for fear to disappear, they act with it present but controlled. This discipline ensures that decisions are guided by logic and strategy rather than emotional avoidance, even in high-stakes environments. Effective decision-making under pressure requires a structured framework that simplifies complexity into manageable actions. Leaders do not rely on intuition alone, they use mental models that guide rapid thinking. One such model involves categorizing decisions into 3 types: reversible, irreversible, and critical. Reversible decisions can be made quickly and adjusted later, which allows speed without hesitation. Irreversible decisions require deeper analysis but still cannot be delayed indefinitely. Critical decisions demand immediate stabilization of outcomes to prevent escalation. This classification helps prioritize thinking effort. Another framework involves the cycle of assess, decide, act, and adjust. Leaders first assess available information, then make a directional decision, execute quickly, and refine based on feedback. This iterative loop prevents stagnation and encourages adaptability. Under pressure, leaders also focus on identifying the minimum viable action required to stabilize a situation. Instead of searching for perfect solutions, they choose the smallest effective step that restores control or clarity. This prevents overwhelm and creates immediate momentum. Decision clarity is further strengthened by eliminating irrelevant variables. Leaders narrow focus to factors that directly influence outcomes, ignoring distractions that slow judgment. Communication also plays a role in decision efficiency. Leaders clearly articulate decisions and next steps to ensure alignment, reducing confusion and repeated clarification. This structured approach transforms pressure from chaos into a sequence of manageable actions. The goal is not to eliminate uncertainty but to operate effectively within it. Leaders who apply structured frameworks consistently develop faster judgment, reduced hesitation, and stronger control in high-pressure environments. Calmness under stress is the hidden advantage that determines decision quality. While others react emotionally, leaders regulate their internal state to preserve clarity. This calmness is not natural, it is trained through repeated exposure and conscious control. One method involves slowing physical responses such as breathing and speech. This directly influences cognitive processing, allowing more rational thought under pressure. Leaders also create mental distance from the situation by reframing urgency as a structured problem rather than a crisis. This shift reduces emotional intensity and improves analytical thinking. Another key practice is prioritizing control over influence. Leaders focus only on variables they can affect, which reduces mental overload and increases focus. Stress often arises from attempting to manage uncontrollable factors, but disciplined thinking removes this burden. Leaders also maintain consistent routines under pressure, which stabilizes mental patterns. Familiar behavior during chaos signals control to the brain, reducing anxiety responses. Additionally, they avoid emotional contagion by limiting exposure to panic-driven individuals or information. This protects decision clarity. Calmness also improves communication. Leaders speak with measured tone, reducing confusion and stabilizing teams. Over time, calm under pressure becomes a defining trait of leadership presence. It signals reliability, precision, and control. When decisions are made from a calm state, they are more structured, less reactive, and more aligned with long-term objectives. In leadership, calmness is not passive, it is an active form of control that enables faster, smarter, and more effective decisions when conditions are most uncertain. Chapter number 7, Taking Ownership, the habit that separates leaders from workers. Taking ownership is the defining line between leadership and dependency. Most people operate in a mental framework where outcomes are always partially assigned to external forces, the system, the environment, the team, or timing. This creates a psychological distance between action and consequence. Workers often protect themselves by distributing responsibility outward, which allows them to avoid discomfort but also removes control. Leaders reject this pattern completely. They understand that authority only exists where responsibility is fully accepted. Ownership means that even when circumstances are not your fault, the outcome still becomes your responsibility to address. This shift is uncomfortable at first because it removes excuses as emotional protection. However, it also creates power, because what you own, you can improve. Leaders focus on what is within their influence rather than what is outside it. Instead of asking who caused the issue, they ask what can be done now to fix or stabilize it. This eliminates delay and replaces emotional reaction with strategic response. Ownership also changes perception of failure. Instead of viewing setbacks as external failures, leaders interpret them as feedback on their decisions, preparation, or execution. This does not mean self-blame, it means self-responsibility. The difference is critical. Blame freezes thinking, while ownership activates learning. Over time, this mindset builds resilience. Leaders become less dependent on ideal conditions and more capable of operating in imperfect environments. The habit of ownership transforms uncertainty into responsibility, and responsibility into action. Excuses are the natural defense mechanism of a follower mindset. They create temporary relief by shifting responsibility away from the individual, but they also eliminate control over improvement. Workers often justify underperformance by pointing to time constraints, unclear instructions, or external interference. While these factors may be real, leaders refuse to let them define outcomes. They recognize that excuses do not change results, they only delay accountability. Ownership removes this delay entirely. Instead of explaining why something did not work, leaders focus on what can be adjusted immediately. This shift moves energy from justification to correction. A key behavioral change is eliminating explanatory language that protects ego. Leaders reduce phrases that distance themselves from responsibility and replace them with direct acknowledgement of outcomes. This creates clarity in communication and trust in perception. Another important shift is how leaders interpret mistakes. Instead of viewing errors as evidence of limitation, they treat them as signals of system weakness or decision gaps. This allows rapid correction without emotional resistance. Excuses often come from a fear of judgment, but leaders reduce this fear by detaching identity from performance. They understand that performance fluctuates, but responsibility remains constant. By removing emotional attachment to being right, they become faster at identifying errors and implementing solutions. Over time, this discipline eliminates the habit of deflection. Leaders stop narrating circumstances and start reshaping them. This is where growth accelerates, because energy is no longer wasted on explanation but fully invested in improvement. Extreme ownership requires a shift in thinking from external dependence to internal control. Leaders train themselves to identify every situation as something they can influence, even if indirectly. This does not mean ignoring external factors, it means refusing to stop at them. Instead of saying this is not my responsibility, leaders ask how their role interacts with the situation and where intervention is possible. This expands awareness and reduces passivity. A practical method is mapping outcomes backward from results to decisions. When something fails, leaders trace the chain of actions that led to it, identifying where better judgment, preparation, or communication could have altered the result. This analytical approach removes emotional distortion and replaces it with structural understanding. Another behavior is proactive correction. Leaders do not wait for permission to fix problems within their scope. They act immediately when they recognize gaps, even if the issue originated elsewhere. This creates reliability and builds trust in their judgment. Ownership also influences communication style. Leaders report issues with clarity and proposed solutions, not just problems. This signals responsibility and readiness to act. Over time, this behavior changes how others perceive them. They are no longer seen as task executors but as problem solvers. Extreme ownership also improves decision speed because hesitation decreases when responsibility is clear. When you know the outcome depends on you, indecision becomes unacceptable. This clarity forces action, and action creates learning. Leaders grow faster because they never disconnect themselves from outcomes, regardless of origin. The contrast between ownership and dependency becomes most visible under pressure. Workers often slow down or disengage when conditions become difficult, waiting for guidance or external correction. Leaders move in the opposite direction. Pressure activates responsibility rather than avoidance. They immediately assess what is within their control and act on it. This behavior stabilizes chaos because someone is actively managing outcomes instead of reacting emotionally. Dependency thinking waits for instructions, ownership thinking creates direction. This difference defines performance consistency. Leaders also avoid transferring blame to maintain psychological comfort. They understand that blame does not solve problems, it only shifts attention away from solutions. Instead, they focus on resolution speed. Another key difference is how feedback is received. Workers may interpret criticism as personal attack, while leaders interpret it as operational data. This allows them to adjust quickly without emotional resistance. Ownership also changes how mistakes are communicated. Leaders openly acknowledge errors without dilution, which strengthens credibility rather than weakening it. People trust those who take responsibility without defensiveness. Over time, this transparency builds authority. Dependency creates fragility because it relies on external validation, but ownership creates stability because it relies on internal control. Even when systems fail, leaders remain effective because their response is independent of conditions. This consistency under pressure is what separates leadership from execution roles. Ownership ensures that no matter what happens externally, internal responsibility remains active, which preserves momentum and decision clarity. Developing ownership as a habit requires deliberate mental and behavioral rewiring. The first step is eliminating passive language from internal and external communication. Instead of saying it happened, leaders say I allowed it or I contributed to it. This linguistic shift reinforces responsibility at a cognitive level. The second step is immediate accountability after outcomes, whether positive or negative. Leaders conduct quick reviews of decisions, identifying what they influence directly. This prevents externalization from forming. Another important habit is proactive anticipation. Leaders think ahead about potential failures and design preventive actions. This reduces reliance on reactive correction and strengthens control. Ownership also requires consistent self-questioning. Before assigning responsibility elsewhere, leaders pause and ask what role their decisions, timing, or communication played. This interruption breaks automatic blame patterns. Another behavior is taking responsibility in group settings without hesitation. Leaders step forward when issues arise, even if they were not the primary cause, because they understand that leadership is defined by response, not origin. Over time, these habits build psychological conditioning. The mind begins defaulting to responsibility rather than avoidance. This creates a shift in identity. You no longer see yourself as someone who executes tasks but as someone who ensures outcomes. This internal shift is where leadership solidifies, because ownership turns every situation into a point of influence rather than a point of excuse. Ultimately, taking ownership transforms identity from reactive to directive. Leaders do not wait for circumstances to align before acting, they assume responsibility for aligning outcomes through behavior. This mindset removes victim thinking entirely. There is no space for helplessness when responsibility is internalized. Even in situations where control is limited, leaders focus on response quality rather than external conditions. This ensures that growth is constant regardless of environment. Ownership also strengthens authority because consistency builds trust. People follow those who do not shift responsibility when pressure increases. It creates psychological safety for teams because accountability is predictable. Leaders who practice ownership become stabilizers in unstable environments. Their presence reduces confusion and increases clarity because responsibility is clearly held. Over time, this habit compounds into influence. You are no longer evaluated by what happens around you, but by how effectively you respond to it. That is the essence of leadership behavior. Ownership is not a single decision, it is a continuous practice of refusing to outsource responsibility. When this becomes your default mindset, every challenge becomes manageable, every failure becomes instructional, and every success becomes repeatable. This is how leaders are built, not by avoiding blame, but by eliminating the need for it entirely. Chapter number 8, Handling Criticism, Failure, and Rejection Like a Leader. Criticism, failure, and rejection are not interruptions in leadership, they are constant inputs that shape judgment, refine behavior, and expose weak assumptions. Most people experience these moments as personal attacks, which triggers emotional defense, denial, or withdrawal. Workers often interpret criticism as a signal of inadequacy, leading them to justify, argue, or avoid similar situations in the future. Leaders operate through a different lens entirely. They separate identity from feedback, treating criticism as information rather than judgment. This separation is the foundation of emotional stability. When feedback is received, the first step is not reaction but analysis. What is being said, what evidence supports it, and what part of it can improve performance? Leaders filter out emotional tone and extract usable data. This prevents distortion and keeps thinking objective. Failure is also redefined. Instead of viewing failure as an endpoint, leaders see it as a breakdown in process, timing, or decision structure. This shifts attention from shame to mechanics. The question becomes not why did this happen to me, but what exactly caused this outcome and what must change. Rejection follows the same principle. Rather than personalizing rejection, leaders treat it as alignment feedback, indicating mismatch between approach and expectation. This reduces emotional volatility. Over time, this disciplined interpretation builds resilience. Leaders remain steady because their thinking does not collapse under external judgment. They remain focused on correction rather than reaction, which allows continuous progress even under pressure. Handling criticism effectively requires structured emotional control, not suppression. Leaders do not ignore emotional responses, they manage them so they do not interfere with analysis. When criticism is received, the initial instinct may be discomfort or defensiveness, but leaders introduce a pause before responding. This pause is critical because it interrupts automatic reaction patterns. During this moment, they separate content from delivery. Content refers to the actual message, while delivery refers to tone or style. Leaders evaluate only content first. If useful insight exists, it is absorbed regardless of how it was delivered. This prevents ego interference. Another key technique is paraphrasing feedback before responding. By restating what was heard, leaders ensure understanding and reduce misinterpretation. This also signals maturity and control. Leaders avoid immediate justification because justification is often emotional rather than analytical. Instead, they ask clarifying questions that deepen understanding. This transforms criticism into a dialogue rather than confrontation. Over time, this behavior changes how others communicate with them. People become more precise because they recognize that feedback is taken seriously and analyzed objectively. Leaders also review criticism later in isolation to determine patterns. If similar feedback appears repeatedly, it signals a systemic issue that requires correction. This structured approach ensures that criticism becomes a development tool rather than an emotional trigger. Emotional control in this context is not about being unaffected, it is about remaining functional while processing discomfort without distortion. Failure is one of the most powerful training environments for leadership thinking, but only when processed correctly. Workers often interpret failure as a signal to reduce risk or avoid similar challenges, which limits growth. Leaders interpret failure as a breakdown in execution logic. Instead of internalizing it as identity damage, they dissect it as a sequence of decisions that led to an undesired outcome. This analytical approach removes emotional weight and increases learning speed. A practical method leaders use is reverse analysis, where they reconstruct events step by step to identify where judgment, timing, or information was insufficient. This allows precise correction rather than vague regret. Leaders also distinguish between controllable and uncontrollable factors within failure. This prevents wasted energy on elements that cannot be changed and directs focus toward actionable improvements. Another critical behavior is rapid recovery. Leaders do not extend emotional engagement with failure beyond its analytical usefulness. Once lessons are extracted, attention shifts forward immediately. This prevents stagnation. Failure is also reframed as cost of progress. Instead of avoiding it, leaders accept it as part of experimentation and decision-making under uncertainty. This mindset encourages calculated risk-taking. Over time, repeated exposure to failure without emotional collapse builds psychological strength. Leaders become less fragile because their identity is not tied to flawless execution but to consistent improvement. This stability allows them to operate in environments where uncertainty is constant and outcomes are not guaranteed. Rejection challenges ego more directly than failure because it often feels personal. However, leaders learn to reframe rejection as information about alignment rather than value. When an idea, proposal, or effort is rejected, it does not mean the individual lacks capability, it means the timing, approach, or context did not match expectations. This distinction is critical for emotional stability. Workers often interpret rejection as invalidation, which leads to hesitation in future attempts. Leaders remove this interpretation entirely. Instead, they analyze rejection structurally. What factors influenced the decision, what criteria were prioritized, and how future attempts can be adjusted. This converts rejection into strategic feedback. Another important behavior is detachment from outcome dependency. Leaders do not base confidence on acceptance or approval. Instead, confidence is grounded in preparation and effort. This reduces emotional volatility when outcomes differ from expectations. Leaders also normalize rejection as part of iteration. Not every attempt is designed to succeed, many are designed to refine direction. This perspective reduces fear and encourages consistent action. Over time, rejection loses its emotional impact and becomes a routine signal guiding improvement. Leaders who master this mindset maintain momentum even in environments where approval is inconsistent. They continue refining approach without internal disruption, which increases long-term effectiveness and resilience. Stability under pressure is built through consistent mental practices that prevent emotional escalation. Leaders train themselves to slow internal reactions when external conditions intensify. This begins with controlled breathing and deliberate pacing in thought and speech. By reducing internal speed, they regain cognitive control. Another method is grounding attention in facts rather than interpretations. Instead of assuming meaning behind criticism, failure, or rejection, leaders focus on observable data. This reduces emotional amplification. Leaders also avoid immediate narrative creation, which is the tendency to assign meaning too quickly. Instead, they delay interpretation until sufficient information is available. This prevents biased conclusions. Another stabilizing practice is maintaining routine behavior during stress. By continuing structured habits, leaders signal to their mind that control is intact, which reduces anxiety responses. They also limit exposure to emotionally reactive environments during analysis phases, ensuring clarity before engagement. Over time, these practices create mental resilience. Pressure no longer destabilizes thinking, it sharpens focus. Leaders become capable of functioning effectively even when outcomes are uncertain or unfavorable. This stability is not passive calmness but active regulation of thought, attention, and response. It ensures that decisions remain logical even when external conditions are unstable or emotionally charged. Ultimately, handling criticism, failure, and rejection like a leader is about transforming emotional experiences into structured intelligence. Instead of resisting discomfort, leaders extract value from it. Every critique becomes data, every failure becomes instruction, and every rejection becomes alignment feedback. This consistent reinterpretation builds psychological endurance. Over time, emotional reactions diminish not because feelings disappear, but because interpretation becomes disciplined. Leaders stop reacting to surface-level impact and start analyzing underlying systems. This shift creates long-term stability and continuous improvement. Their identity is no longer threatened by external judgment because their focus is anchored in learning and adjustment. As a result, setbacks lose their power to derail progress. Instead, they become integrated into a feedback loop that strengthens decision-making and behavior. This is the essence of leadership resilience, not avoidance of difficulty, but mastery of response. When you reach this level of thinking, criticism no longer weakens you, failure no longer stops you, and rejection no longer defines you. Instead, each becomes a mechanism that sharpens judgment, strengthens clarity, and reinforces forward movement in the direction of leadership. Chapter number 9, Influence and Presence, How to Command Respect Without Demanding It. Respect is not something leaders request or negotiate, it is something their behavior generates consistently over time. Most people attempt to gain respect through verbal assertion, position, or emotional intensity, but these approaches only create temporary compliance, not genuine influence. Leaders understand that respect is a byproduct of stability, clarity, and predictability in action. When someone consistently demonstrates sound judgment, calm behavior under pressure, and accountability in outcomes, respect forms naturally in the perception of others. This is because humans trust patterns more than promises. A leader's presence communicates reliability before a single word is spoken. People observe how decisions are made, how mistakes are handled, and how pressure is managed. These microbehaviors accumulate into an unspoken reputation. Influence begins forming long before formal authority is recognized. Leaders do not try to appear important, they focus on being effective. That effectiveness, repeated consistently, becomes authority in the eyes of others. The absence of emotional volatility is especially powerful. When others react impulsively, the leader remains composed, creating a psychological anchor in unstable environments. This calmness is interpreted as competence. Over time, people naturally defer to those who reduce uncertainty and increase clarity. Respect, therefore, is not demanded, it is earned through consistent demonstration of control, clarity, and reliability in action. Body language is one of the most immediate expressions of leadership presence, often communicating more than words. Leaders understand that posture, eye contact, and movement shape perception before speech begins. A stable posture signals internal control, while rushed or fragmented movements suggest uncertainty. Leaders avoid unnecessary physical agitation because it disrupts perceived confidence. Eye contact is used with intention, not intensity, maintaining balance between engagement and calm detachment. This creates a sense of grounded awareness. Speech is measured rather than rushed, reinforcing clarity and composure. Leaders do not fill silence with nervous explanation, instead, they allow pauses to emphasize thoughtfulness. Silence is not absence but control. It signals that the leader is processing, not reacting. This controlled use of silence often increases influence because it forces others to pay closer attention. In conversations, leaders do not compete for verbal space. They observe first, understand context, and then contribute with precision. This restraint creates weight in their communication. People value input more when it is not constantly given. Body language also reflects emotional regulation. Leaders avoid exaggerated gestures or expressions that signal instability. Instead, they maintain steady, predictable physical behavior. Over time, this consistency builds subconscious trust. Others begin to associate calm physical presence with reliable decision-making. Influence grows not through performance but through controlled expression, where every movement reinforces the perception of stability and competence. Decision clarity is another core pillar of influence. Leaders are trusted not because they always have perfect answers, but because they consistently provide direction when it is needed. Uncertainty in decision-making creates hesitation in others, while clarity creates alignment. Leaders reduce ambiguity by structuring their thinking before speaking. They evaluate the situation, identify priorities, and communicate decisions in a direct, organized manner. This removes confusion and accelerates action. Importantly, leaders do not over-explain their decisions. Excess explanation often signals insecurity, while concise reasoning signals confidence. When decisions are communicated, they are framed in terms of outcomes rather than opinions. This shifts focus from personal preference to objective direction. Leaders also remain open to adjustment, but once a decision is made, they communicate it with stability. This prevents mixed signals, which weaken influence. Another key behavior is consistency between decisions and actions. When words and behavior align repeatedly, trust compounds. People begin to rely on the leader's judgment because it produces predictable results. Even when outcomes are uncertain, the decision-making process remains structured, which maintains confidence. Leaders also avoid indecisiveness in public environments. Internal deliberation happens privately, external communication reflects clarity. This separation ensures that others are never exposed to uncertainty unnecessarily. Over time, decision clarity becomes a defining trait of leadership presence, reinforcing respect through reliability rather than force. Reliability is the silent force behind lasting influence. While charisma may attract attention, it is consistency that sustains respect. Leaders build influence by repeatedly doing what they said they would do, especially when conditions become difficult. This creates psychological trust because people learn that the leader's behavior is not dependent on mood or convenience. Reliability is built through small, repeated actions rather than dramatic moments. Meeting deadlines, following through on commitments, and maintaining standards under pressure all contribute to this perception. Leaders understand that every unfulfilled expectation weakens authority, while every fulfilled commitment strengthens it. Over time, this pattern creates credibility that does not need reinforcement. People begin to assume reliability without needing proof each time. This reduces the need for self-promotion, as reputation speaks for itself. Leaders also avoid overcommitting, recognizing that broken expectations damage influence more than low output. Instead, they commit only to what can be consistently delivered. This discipline protects long-term authority. Reliability also includes emotional consistency. Leaders do not fluctuate dramatically in tone, behavior, or judgment based on circumstances. This stability reassures others during uncertainty. When people know what to expect, they feel safe following direction. Influence grows strongest in environments where predictability exists. Leaders create that environment through disciplined consistency in both action and presence, ensuring that trust is built gradually and sustained continuously. Presence is the integration of all leadership behaviors into a single observable quality that others immediately feel but cannot easily define. It is not loudness, dominance, or performance, it is the absence of internal chaos expressed externally through calm, controlled behavior. Leaders develop presence by aligning thought, speech, and action into coherence. When internal thinking is structured, communication becomes clear, and behavior becomes stable. This alignment creates a natural authority that does not rely on force. Presence is most visible under pressure. While others become reactive or fragmented, leaders remain centered, making them a stabilizing reference point. This psychological effect draws attention and trust naturally. Presence is also strengthened through restraint. Leaders do not overreact, over-explain, or overcompensate. They allow space in communication, which increases their influence. People are more attentive when not overwhelmed by unnecessary input. Another aspect of presence is intentional engagement. Leaders are fully attentive when interacting, not distracted or mentally divided. This focused attention signals respect and importance, increasing mutual regard. Over time, presence becomes recognizable even in silence. Others can sense stability without words. This is because presence is not something performed, it is something developed through disciplined behavior over time. It reflects internal order expressed externally. When presence is strong, influence becomes effortless because people naturally align with those who appear composed, aware, and grounded in control. Ultimately, commanding respect without demanding it is the result of sustained behavioral discipline. Leaders do not chase influence, they build conditions where influence naturally emerges. Every interaction becomes an opportunity to reinforce stability, clarity, and reliability. Respect is not gained through assertion but through accumulation of consistent behavior over time. When people observe repeated evidence of sound judgment, emotional control, and dependable action, they adjust their perception automatically. This adjustment is not forced, it is a response to pattern recognition. Leaders understand that influence cannot be separated from behavior, because every action communicates credibility or inconsistency. As a result, they focus on refinement rather than impression. They reduce unnecessary speech, eliminate reactive behavior, and strengthen decision structure. Over time, this creates a reputation that precedes them. Influence becomes embedded in how others expect them to respond. This expectation is the highest form of respect because it requires no enforcement. It is maintained by trust. In leadership, true authority is never announced, it is recognized. And it is recognized not through intensity, but through consistency, composure, and the quiet strength of someone who remains in control regardless of circumstance. Chapter number 10, Leadership Pitfalls: What to Avoid If You Don't Want to Stay Average. Most people do not fail at leadership because they lack opportunity, they fail because they repeatedly fall into predictable psychological traps that quietly keep them average. The first and most destructive of these is ego. Ego convinces you that being right matters more than being effective, that defending your image is more important than improving your outcome. It makes feedback feel like an attack and correction feel like disrespect. When ego leads, learning stops, because everything becomes personal. Leaders who remain trapped in ego spend more energy protecting their identity than developing their capability. The result is stagnation disguised as confidence. Another critical pitfall is inconsistency. Many individuals show discipline only when motivated, then collapse into distraction when pressure fades. This creates unpredictable performance, which destroys trust and limits responsibility. Leadership requires stability, not bursts of effort. A leader who cannot sustain behavior under ordinary conditions will never be trusted with extraordinary ones. Avoiding these traps requires constant self-observation. You must regularly ask whether your actions are driven by improvement or image protection. When ego appears, it must be identified immediately and replaced with objective thinking. When inconsistency appears, systems must replace motivation. Structure must replace mood. Without this correction, average behavior becomes your default identity, reinforced daily by repetition. Fear is another silent destroyer of leadership potential, and it rarely appears as obvious panic. Instead, it shows up as hesitation, delay, and overthinking. Fear convinces you that waiting is safer than acting, even when waiting creates greater risk. It disguises itself as caution, but in reality it is avoidance of responsibility. Leaders who do not confront fear directly end up living in reactive mode, always responding too late instead of directing outcomes early. This creates a cycle where opportunities are missed and confidence erodes. Fear also distorts perception, making challenges appear larger than they are and reducing clarity under pressure. The only way to break this pattern is through exposure and structured action. Leaders train themselves to act with incomplete information, accepting that clarity improves through movement, not hesitation. They focus on reducing decision complexity rather than eliminating uncertainty. Another essential correction is redefining failure. Fear loses power when failure is seen as feedback instead of identity damage. When you stop interpreting mistakes as personal threats, action becomes easier and faster. Without this shift, fear will continue to govern your decisions, keeping you in a safe but stagnant position where growth is impossible. Lack of discipline is one of the most underestimated leadership killers because it does not create immediate failure, it creates gradual decline. People who lack discipline often believe they are flexible or adaptable, but in reality they are inconsistent and unreliable. Without discipline, intentions remain unexecuted, plans remain incomplete, and standards slowly erode. Leaders cannot function in this state because leadership depends on predictability of behavior. If you cannot control your actions when no one is watching, you cannot be trusted when responsibility increases. Discipline is not about intensity, it is about repetition. It is the ability to perform required actions regardless of emotional state. Without this ability, every challenge becomes optional, and every distraction becomes an excuse. Over time, this creates a pattern of broken commitments, both internal and external. The corrective strategy is to remove reliance on motivation entirely. Leaders build systems that enforce behavior through structure, not feeling. They define non-negotiable actions and execute them regardless of conditions. This creates stability. Discipline also requires reducing unnecessary choices that drain mental energy. By simplifying routines, leaders protect focus for high-impact decisions. Without discipline, potential remains theoretical. With discipline, potential becomes execution. The difference between average and leadership performance is rarely talent, it is consistency in action under ordinary circumstances. Poor thinking is another major pitfall that silently limits leadership growth. Many people believe they are thinking when they are actually reacting emotionally or repeating assumptions. Reactive thinking is fast but shallow, it responds to situations without analyzing. Poor thinking is another major pitfall that silently limits leadership growth. Many people believe they are thinking when they are actually reacting emotionally or repeating assumptions. Reactive thinking is fast but shallow, it responds to situations without analyzing structure or consequence. Leaders must move beyond this level and develop structured thinking. This means breaking problems into components, identifying variables, and evaluating outcomes logically rather than emotionally. Without this discipline, decisions are driven by impulse, bias, or social pressure. Another form of poor thinking is binary interpretation, where situations are seen as either success or failure, right or wrong. This limits understanding and reduces adaptability. Leaders think in systems, not extremes. They evaluate progress, probability, and adjustment rather than absolute outcomes. Poor thinking also includes overgeneralization from single events, which distorts judgment and weakens future decisions. The correction requires slowing down thought processes intentionally. Leaders create space between stimulus and response to evaluate information properly. They ask structured questions instead of reacting instantly. What is actually happening, what does it mean, and what action produces improvement? Dependency is perhaps the most subtle but dangerous leadership pitfall because it hides behind cooperation and teamwork. Dependency occurs when individuals rely excessively on external direction, validation, or approval before acting. This creates a psychological condition where initiative is constantly delayed. Workers often wait for instructions, confirmation, or reassurance before making decisions, which slows progress and weakens accountability. Leaders cannot afford this behavior because leadership requires ownership of direction, not waiting for it. Dependency also reduces confidence over time, because repeated reliance on others reinforces the belief that independent judgment is insufficient. The corrective approach is gradual autonomy training. Leaders intentionally practice making decisions without external validation and then evaluate outcomes afterward. This builds internal reference systems for judgment. Another strategy is reducing unnecessary consultation for minor decisions. While collaboration is important, over-reliance on input creates hesitation. Leaders learn to distinguish between decisions that require alignment and those that require execution. Dependency also weakens problem-solving ability because it shifts responsibility outward. To counter this, leaders repeatedly ask what can be controlled directly in any situation. This recenters responsibility internally. Without breaking dependency patterns, growth remains limited by external input. With independence, decision speed increases, confidence stabilizes, and leadership capacity expands significantly. Ultimately, leadership pitfalls are not dramatic failures, they are repeated patterns of behavior that go uncorrected. Ego, fear, inconsistency, poor thinking, and dependency do not destroy leadership potential overnight. They erode it gradually through repetition until average performance becomes identity. The danger lies in their subtlety. Most individuals do not recognize these patterns because they feel normal. That is why awareness is the first correction. You must observe your own behavior with honesty and identify where these patterns appear in daily decisions. Once identified, correction must be immediate and consistent. Ego must be replaced with learning, fear with action, inconsistency with structure, poor thinking with analysis, and dependency with ownership. These are not motivational changes, they are behavioral rewiring processes. Leaders are not defined by perfection but by their ability to continuously eliminate weaknesses that limit effectiveness. Every avoided pitfall strengthens clarity, increases reliability, and sharpens decision-making. The path away from average is not built through inspiration, but through disciplined removal of the habits that keep you stuck. When these pitfalls are controlled, leadership stops being a concept and becomes a natural outcome of how you think, act, and respond in every situation.